Hello, Year 11. This is the first of, I guess, sort of several videos where I'm going to walk you through your next exam, or really walk you through revising for your next exam, which is on the 7th of June, and it's about the Norman Conquest and the Migrants to Britain, those two together. In fact, they come in the other order in your exam. Migrants to Britain will be first, and the Norman Conquest will be second. I had just done a whole video where I did all of these notes in front of you, but unfortunately the video recorded no sound, so I will just sort of talk you through them now. I'm going to break down your exam into different areas that you might study. I'm weirdly going to start at the end and start by talking about modern migration, and you'll see that topic here at the top of my revision page. And I would always start year 11 with a timeline where you're going to just draw a line across the top of your sheet. Now, you're not going to fill that in immediately. That's not going to be the first thing you start to do. But I would always have that at the top, and we'll just sort of add to it as you start to revise. And I'll show you what I mean by that as we go on, okay? And then when you're revising for migrants, I would just start by breaking it down into groups and areas that you're going to focus on. So, for example, I've done a whole section here on Commonwealth migrants. Remember, Commonwealth migrants means they're arriving after 1948 because of two things. Firstly, because of the Commonwealth and Commonwealth Citizenship Act. That makes all Commonwealth people in the Commonwealth citizens of the British Empire, or citizens of Britain. Gives them access to a passport. The British government are also going out to colonies in the Caribbean, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago most typically, but others like British Guyana and Barbados as well, and actually inviting the migrants to come to Britain to rebuild Britain after the war. Just be mindful that we talk about two different groups in relation to migration from the empire or former empire. Empire migrants, that's before 1948, migrants arriving from colonies in the British Empire. After 1948, because of this act, the Commonwealth Citizenship Act, we refer to them as Commonwealth migrants, and they will use that in the exam. These are countries typically that are leaving the British Empire. India, for example, leaves in 1947, and then they are choosing themselves to join up to this club, the Commonwealth, which gives their people rights like having a British passport, etc. And it means they're able to migrate to the UK. So, the first or most kind of important event or date for us, right, initially is the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, carrying the first few thousand, it's 1,500 in total from memory, migrants from the Caribbean. And they all find jobs, that should say, as they've been invited by the government to rebuild Britain. Now, after that date, in the 1950s and 1960s, at least in the early part, more and more migrants start arriving from the Commonwealth. They are coming for jobs or to follow their family and friends. Especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we have what some historians call a kind of second wave of migration, where the families, the children and the wives of those migrants who came earlier for work from the Caribbean and also from India, Bangladesh, or East Pakistan as it was in 1947, and Pakistan, they're following their fathers essentially to the UK once they've been a bit more settled here. And lots of those Caribbean and Indian migrants are finding jobs, but they tend to be low-paid jobs, and they're therefore settling in the poorer areas of typically cities. Areas in London like Stepney Green, Notting Hill and Brixton tend to be places where Caribbean migrants settle. Similarly, we see lots of Indian migrants, and by that I mean from Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, settling in cities like Leicester and Birmingham, or areas of London like Southall and Hounslow. Birmingham also, by the way, along with Liverpool, Manchester, other cities, is a real kind of hotbed of Caribbean migration as well. Now, what does that sort of influx of Caribbean and Indian migration, and for this part we are going to focus mainly on Caribbean migrants, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to tensions between black and white people in areas in which they settle. And those become racial tensions. The two kind of are conflated together, become one of the same. Why? Because lots of those Caribbean migrants who are arriving are, of course, black. And so that causes tension between black and white groups in the places they settle. Again, Brixton, Notting Hill, Stepney Green, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, etc. Now, sometimes those tensions can bubble over into really much more serious events. And the biggest one, I guess, that we studied was the Notting Hill riots in 1958. They are sparked by gangs of teddy boys, and I want to be clear here, people who were not from the white community in Notting Hill, going to Notting Hill because they've heard it's an area where Caribbean migrants are settling, and attacking black-owned businesses and also Caribbean migrants there. There's the common story that's told is on the 20th of August 1958, a Swedish migrant is attacked because she's in a mixed race relationship with a Caribbean man in Notting Hill. What those initial kind of small scale attacks spark is a much wider riot, where roughly 400 Teddy Boys was a youth group or a youth movement in the 1950s of typically young men who listened to rock and roll music and dressed a certain way. A group, 400 kind of Teddy Boys, head to the area of Notting Hill and begin what are, let's be honest, racist attacks on Caribbean migrants, their homes and their businesses. Now, what's also really useful for us when we're trying to build this story of Caribbean or Commonwealth migration to Britain is to think about the impact of that. And there are positive impacts from the Notting Hill riots, happily, in 1958. Because Claudia Jones, an amazing woman, in 1959 runs the first Caribbean carnival. She wanted to heal the Notting Hill community, to fight back against racism and fight for unity in the area, to bring the white and black communities back together and heal Notting Hill. Of course, in the 1960s, this becomes the Notting Hill Carnival. Now today, in 2022, 2 million people went to the Notting Hill Carnival last year. It is the largest street party in Europe. In fact, it's second only to the Carnival in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. It is a huge celebration of Caribbean British culture and is still designed today to bring together all communities from our country, from Britain. We are not a divided nation. We are all British, and we are all combined or joined, I suppose, under our shared values. And the Notting Hill Carnival really is the perfect embodiment of that. Now, that's all I'm going to talk about in relation to Commonwealth or Caribbean migrants specifically, but I would go and do some more research yourself on some other important events. You're going to want to know about the Bristol bus boycotts in the 1960s. You're also going to want to go and research the Brixton riots in 1981, which is sparked by the SUS laws, the stop and search laws, which I'd also go and do some research about. And you might also want to go and do some research about other stories around, positive stories around the impact of Caribbean migration to the UK. You know, the development of reggae music or ska music, bands like the Specials in 1980s in England. The impact of Caribbean culture that we see in comedy or TV programs today. You also might want to go or I really would encourage you to go and do some research about the Stephen Lawrence case, but I'll talk more about that briefly later on. Once you've started to, once you've done the Commonwealth migrants, you've broken down that group, you're just going to want to go through in your revision for these in preparation for your migration exam and think about other key groups. Sorry, I should have said, by the way, if you can hear people playing football in the background, my windows are open, it's very hot in here, so unfortunately you'll just have to cope with it. Same goes with the planes flying over too. So the second group, which I would break things down to for the migration unit, is refugees. And we see several refugee groups coming to Britain in the modern period. Belgian refugees come during World War One. Now, in actual fact, this was the most migrants that Britain has ever welcomed then or since, the most refugee migrants in one lot. What's, of course, perhaps limiting, though, is that after World War One, these Belgian refugees are sent back by the government. However, I think we should keep in mind that many of them probably wanted to go back to their home. I think we see this today, don't we, with Ukrainian migrants to the UK. We have some in our school, and when you talk to them, they're desperate to go back home and can't wait to be able to go back afterwards. The other big group that are arriving are Jewish refugees. That's, of course, during World War II, or really just before World War II, especially in 1938 and 1939. And they are typically coming from Germany, although later in the war, as countries start to become close to being occupied by the Germans, places like the Netherlands, for example, they're also coming from other countries too. And I suppose the most famous or well-known case as part of these migrations from Jewish migrations from Germany is the Kindertransport in 1938, where British charities arranged for thousands of Jewish children to come to the UK for protection, many of whom themselves or their ancestors are still living safely here in the UK today, having been settled with UK families, as lots of their children were orphans. In 1972, Britain welcomed Ugandan Asian refugees who'd been expelled from Uganda by the dictator there, Idi Amin. Now, you might think it odd that we call them Ugandan Asians. Well, if you think back to year 8, you might remember when we studied indentured labour after the abolition of slavery in 1833, that Britain had moved several Indian people, really forced, from India to the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations there, to replace the enslaved workers, or at least some of them. Well, the same thing was happening elsewhere in the British Empire. And one of those other places it's happening is in Africa. South Africa, Nigeria, and also Uganda, which was another British colony. The British are again moving Indians as indentured labour, also Chinese as well, by the way, to countries like that. And in 1972, Idi Amin expelled all Indians, all Ugandan Asians, and lots of them come and take refuge here in Britain. But of course we have more recent cases, right? In 2012, we have Syrian refugees, or 2012 and for a few years afterwards, really. I used to teach some Syrian refugees at my old school. And in 2022, of course, we have Ukrainian refugees arriving. And we've all experienced this, or have certainly seen it in the news, over the last year or 18 months or so. We also, for all of your areas of study for the migrations unit, medieval, early modern and industrial, as well as the modern period, we also need to think about government or official responses versus people or unofficial responses. Those two terms, official and unofficial response, are things that the exam board love to use, so you need to be aware of what those two mean. Official, government; unofficial, everyone else, people. With the government, we're typically, talking about laws, and so I've just summarised some of these laws for you here. The 1905 Aliens Act, for example, is the first time that migration to Britain is restricted by the government. You can't just migrate here anymore. In World War I and World War II, enemy aliens, which typically meant German people, were sent to prison camps on the Isle of Man. Their treatment is quite positive in some ways. There are social clubs and they could train in certain professions whilst they were there on the Isle of Man, but it is still a prison. They're behind fences, barbed wire fences. You can go and look up pictures of the Isle of Man as it was being used for a prison camp. Lots of these Germans who are being sent there in World War II are refugees, Jewish refugees who've recently arrived. I think if you go and look at the flag of the Isle of Man, there are reasons why that could have been quite scary for them to see. So, yes, they're treated well, but I wouldn't say that this is a positive story, really. In 1948, we have the Citizenship the Commonwealth Citizens Act, which we've already spoken about, which I won't go into, but of course that's really important as marking the start of Commonwealth migration to the UK. And that leads to several laws passed by the government kind of as a response to this. And I suppose as a response to lots of Commonwealth migrants coming to Britain, probably more than the government expected or had planned for. Because in 1962, when the Commonwealth Immigrants Act is passed, which is also then kind of amended again in 1968, they're designed to reduce or really prevent migration from the Commonwealth. In 1962, it adds, rather removes the automatic right of Commonwealth people with British passports to migrate to the UK. Basically, it undoes the Commonwealth Citizenship Act in 1948. Instead, it introduces, for the first time, a sort of work permit, a vouchers system, where you have to meet certain credentials in order to migrate to the UK. And really, what that meant was there were a limited number. You had to be educated or professional, have a professional job. And that really meant that after 1962, they're trying to stop anyone who is not white, really. It is encouraging white migration from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa to a degree as well, rather than encouraging migrants, black migrants, Indian migrants, to come from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or the Caribbean, or Africa as well. In 1968, that's amended and updated again. You must at that point have a father or grandfather who's born in the UK. Again, it's really encouraging migration from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa to a degree, and Canada especially, and discouraging migration from India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Caribbean and Africa. But at the same time, people knew this law was coming in. So actually, before 1961, there's just a massive influx of migrants coming from those places who are trying to get here before this law comes into place. So it maybe didn't actually really slow down migration at all. It's just they all came at once in 1961. In 1971, it gets harder again with the Immigrants Act. That's like real, for the first time, you need a voucher or a work permit to migrate to the UK. But of course, we spoke about earlier, in 1972, a whole raft of migrants, Ugandan Asian refugees arriving from Uganda. And that's because the government actually ignored that rule in 1972 to make sure they could enable those Ugandan Asians to come to safety in the UK. There are, I guess, though, some positive rules here. The Race Relations Act is passed in 1965. It's amended again, I think, in 1968. And that actually is designed to support Caribbean and Indian migrants, Commonwealth migrants, especially in the UK. So we saw the proliferation, the spread of those notorious notes in windows, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, on hotels and hostels and rooms for rent, etc. There were colour bars. If you've gone and read about the Bristol bus boycott by now, you'll be aware of that too. There are colour bars in the workplace where people of colour are being prevented from working in certain jobs. So this Race Relations Act from the government in 1965 is designed to tackle that and make discrimination based on the grounds of race in the workplace or in housing illegal. And is updated again later on, again I think it's in 1968, to make that even stricter and get rid of some loopholes. Later kind of laws which you must be aware of course, in 1973, Britain joins the EU, the European Union, and one of the principles of the EU is free movement for migrants between nations that are part of the EU. And of course that leads to migration from France and Germany and Portugal and Spain, etc. And also, as countries join the EU, it leads to influxes of migration from those countries. And I remember as a young person in the 90s and noughties, those influxes coming when Poland joined the EU, or when Romania joined the EU, or other countries in Eastern Europe. And we see that in our school community, right? the development of migration as a result. But of course, that gave rise to sort of a second wave of anti-migration feeling, and that leads to Brexit, which I'll talk about in a minute, and means basically that Britain leaves the EU in 2016. So that's official responses from the government. Let's talk finally about unofficial responses. Now, I mentioned, didn't I, that there was tension between white and black communities as Caribbean migrants and Indian migrants start to come to Britain after 1948. Well, those sort of anti-migration feelings are given a kind of mouthpiece in 1968 by this politician, Enoch Powell, a very controversial figure, because in 1968 he gives a famous speech called the Rivers of Blood speech, where he talks about how migration has been and will be a terrible thing for the government. A terrible thing for Britain, and will continue to be. Speaks out against migration, basically, as a negative thing. That gives people who are against migration in the UK a mouthpiece, and leads to the development of groups, national, who are anti-migration and racist. Those two things come to be one of the same for these groups. They conflate, they are linked together. Anti-migration and racism for them really become the same thing. The most notorious of those in the 1970s is the National Front. They have their high point in 1978 and 79, and they are a kind of political group, but they are also a popular group. They're everyday people joining. They're a small group, but they are very vocal and very violent. They begin doing protest marches through cities, and also in small groups often are attacking Commonwealth migrants especially. The wonderful historian David Olusoga, for example, talks about his I think his father's Nigerian and his mother is British, so he's mixed race. But he talks about as a young boy seeing the National Front on the streets and also being attacked or abused by them himself. He remembers having a brick thrown through his window that I think actually had NF written on it and telling him and his family to go home. I mean, ridiculous. Their home was Britain. So we see that kind of rise in the 1970s. And as this group kind of begins to fall by the wayside, the British National Party, the BNP, sort of take over from that. They are still around in the 90s and early noughties. I remember probably when I was doing my A-levels or first few years of university, Nick Griffin, the leader of the BNP, being on TV a lot. He was on BBC a lot for impartiality reasons, talking about anti-migration. Make no mistake, there is also racism underlining the BNP party's anti-migration policies and ideas. And I think we should all be aware of that. Now, of course, in the noughties and 2010s, we also see a rise again of anti-migration feeling. And what's really sparking that is what I spoke about earlier with the influx of migration of EU migrants, especially from Eastern Europe, as countries like Poland and Lithuania and Bulgaria, Romania, etc. are joining the EU. That leads to lots of migrants coming to the country in the noughties and 2010s. And that gives rise again to more anti-migration feeling. The mouthpiece of that anti-migration feeling that time is, of course, UKIP, the UK Independence Party led by Nigel Farage, who you might remember. Obviously, a lovely migration Huguenot name for Nigel Farage. Also, go and look up his wife, because you'll see that she's also a migrant. Awash with hypocrisy, year 11, nonetheless, the UK Independence Party campaign against migration in the UK. And they did speak for a lot of people and a lot of people's feelings in the UK, which of course leads to the Brexit vote in 2016, when 52% of the British public vote to leave the EU, and Britain thereafter, of course, leaves the EU. So that's it in terms of kind of big picture stuff on modern migration. But also, as I sort of said at the start, once you've done that, I would be going through and adding these things, adding the key dates to your timeline above. And you can see I've started to do that here. Now you might ask, so why on earth would I do that? I'm just repeating myself. Exactly, that's the point. I've always found one of the best ways for me to revise is to write things out, especially dates, over and over again. Students often ask me, sir, how do you remember all these dates? Well, it's because I've practiced them over and over again, and I've written them out on my board, haven't I, for all the students in the class. So I remember the dates because I write them out so much, and you can use that technique too. Do a timeline at the top, take your dates and write them again. But also it's useful because when you come back to these notes in a few weeks' time, a few days' time, whatever, you can have a quick look at your timeline along the top, read all the events. Oh yeah, I remember about the Commonwealth Citizenship Act, don't need to go and revise that and read about that. Oh, I can't remember anything about the 1959 First Notting Hill Carnival. Great, I'll go and read my notes on that bit and remind myself. That's also brilliant on the morning of your exam, right, to have something quickly to look over and get all of the key bits of information, all the key dates you might need to go in and smash your exam. Okay, so I would always be doing your notes sort of like this, a mind map and timelines. It's really, really effective, all right? But look, that's it. I'll do another couple of these on different sort of periods of our migrants study. If I've got time, I'll do some on the Normans and bits and bobs as well. But keep revising. Look, let's be honest, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. Your GCSEs are all about giving you opportunities to have kind of the next steps. What do you want to go on to do next? Whether it's college, eventually university, an apprenticeship, you need these GCSEs to be able to do those things. Don't limit your choices now because you'll regret it. And the only way to make sure you don't limit your choices is to work hard, graft, and get as much revision done as you can. Miss Jackson and I are behind you. We believe in you. We're confident you're going to do well. But you've got to work. Thanks, Year 11.